When the Middle East clock struck midnight, the world was not prepared for what was about to unfold. The streets were quiet, the skies dark, and yet, behind the silence, something irreversible was in motion. Across the region, whispers of tension had been growing for months, perhaps years, but on this night, they transformed into a thunderous reality. Decisions were made that would leave no room for retreat, no space for denial, and no time to undo what was set in motion. It was the kind of night that rewrites history, not in weeks or months, but in the very heartbeat of a single hour. Midnight is often seen as a moment of stillness, a turning point between the past and the future. But here, in the heart of the Middle East, it became the point where the future itself changed direction. Leaders and generals, working in the shadows, executed strategies that had been crafted with precision. Political tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted, not with loud declarations, but with actions that spoke far louder than any words could. It was a night where hesitation could mean defeat, and boldness was the only currency of survival. As news broke, the people of the region felt an immediate shift. For some, it was a moment of defiance, a declaration that they would no longer be dictated to by forces beyond their borders. For others, it was a night filled with uncertainty and fear of what was to come. The balance of power, already fragile, began to tilt. Countries far beyond the region's borders stayed up through the night, watching events unfold with a mix of apprehension and awe. The global order, so often assumed to be unshakable, now trembled on its foundations. The night carried an energy that could not be ignored. Every move felt deliberate, every decision a message to both friend and foe. The region had seen countless moments of conflict, but this was different. This was a shift in the very rules of the game. When the clock struck midnight, the Middle East crossed a threshold, and the world crossed it with them. This was not just a night of political maneuvering, it was the birth of a new chapter, one that would demand the world's attention for years to come. And as dawn approached, the aftershocks of that midnight hour began to spread, not just across deserts and cities, but across minds and ideologies. The Middle East would never return to what it was before, because once history changes course, it never turns back. Before the clock struck midnight, the Middle East was already a region on edge. Political rivalries, military buildups, and years of unresolved disputes had created an environment thick with unease. This wasn't the kind of tension that makes headlines every day. It was quieter, more insidious, building in diplomatic corridors, backroom negotiations, and whispered conversations among intelligent circles. Everyone could sense that something was coming, yet no one knew exactly when or how it would erupt. In the months leading up to this night, alliances were tested, trust between nations grew thinner, and military movements were carefully observed. Small incidents, a border clash here, a cyber attack there, acted like sparks landing on dry grass. But each time the world assumed it would pass, just as tensions in the Middle East often seem to flare up and then cool down. This time, however, the pressure didn't subside, it only grew. The silence before midnight was deceptive. On the surface, cities carried on with daily life, markets bustled, and people went about their routines. Yet behind closed doors, military commands waited for the signal, and political leaders prepared to make irreversible calls. This was the calm before a storm that would not be contained. When midnight arrived, it wasn't just the hour that changed. It was the very trajectory of the region. That long, suffocating silence had been a prelude to a moment of explosive transformation. And once the storm began, there was no going back. When the first strike came, it was like a lightning bolt splitting the night sky. For months, speculation and rumors had circled, but the moment those weapons hit their target, speculation turned into reality, a grim, undeniable truth. The world often imagines war as something that builds slowly, but in this instant, it arrived suddenly and without restraint. Sirens wailed, news networks scrambled, and social media lit up with unverified reports and shaky footage from phones pressed against windows. In that split second, the Middle East entered a new phase of history. The strike was not just a military maneuver, it was a message, written in fire and smoke, that the balance of power had shifted. It was calculated, deliberate, and loaded with symbolism. Every missile and every explosion spoke a language louder than diplomacy, a declaration that the rules had changed and the old lines in the sand no longer mattered. For civilians, the moment was surreal. Some were jolted awake by the sound, others froze in place as buildings trembled. Families huddled together, phones in hand, desperate for updates, while political leaders scrambled to assess the damage and decide on their next move. The strike wasn't the end. It was the spark that would ignite an uncontrollable sequence of events. In that moment, every nation in the region had to ask itself one question: would it step back or be pulled into the storm? The answer would define the days, months, and years to come. The moment the news broke, the Middle East seemed to hold its breath. Borders, no matter how heavily guarded, could not contain the shockwave that rippled through the region. In capitals from Riyadh to Ankara, from Cairo to Tel Aviv, leaders gathered in urgent meetings behind closed doors, their security councils burning the midnight oil. Every intelligence agency was on high alert, scanning for what might come next. Markets reacted first. Oil prices spiked within hours, a barometer of global anxiety. In the streets, ordinary people whispered in cafes and taxis, and on sidewalks, their voices laced with both fear and a strange sense of inevitability. Everyone knew the tensions had been building for years, but now the game had changed. This wasn't just a local skirmish, it was a signal that the entire region's stability was at stake. Allies began to calculate their loyalties more carefully, and enemies weighed their options with newfound urgency. Some nations strengthened their military postures, while others reached for the phone lines of diplomacy, hoping to prevent a chain reaction. On social media, a storm of opinions and misinformation blurred the lines between fact and rumor, adding to the chaos. To some, the strike was an act of defiance; to others, a reckless gamble. But no one could deny that the Middle East political map had just shifted, even if the exact shape of its future remained unclear. The shockwave wasn't just military or political, it was psychological. It reminded the world that in this region, a single night could undo decades of fragile equilibrium. And as the sun rose the next morning, every nation knew that yesterday's rules no longer applied. While the streets of the Middle East buzzed with tension, far from the region, the great powers of the world began moving pieces on their invisible chessboard. Washington, Moscow, Beijing, and European capitals were suddenly alight with urgent briefings. Publicly, leaders called for calm, but privately, they were recalculating decades of strategy in light of what had just unfolded. In the corridors of power, the strike was dissected in minute detail. The choice of target, the precision of execution, the timing down to the hour. It wasn't just about the immediate impact, it was about the message. And that message had been heard loud and clear. The balance of influence in the Middle East could no longer be taken for granted. Military analysts debated whether this was the beginning of a new regional order or the spark that could ignite a wider confrontation. Intelligence agencies flooded their governments with reports, each laced with warnings of possible escalation. Meanwhile, diplomats began working the back channels, trying to shape the narrative before the other side did. But there was another layer, one that didn't make it into the press briefings. Every global power saw opportunity hidden in the crisis. Some envisioned arms deals, others saw the chance to tilt alliances, and a few considered this the moment to expand their footprint in a region that had always been the heart of the world's geopolitics. For the first time in years, the superpowers weren't dictating the tempo, they were reacting to it. The strike had flipped the script, forcing them into a defensive posture. And in that quiet shift, the rules of the game weren't just being challenged, they were being rewritten. Long after the missiles stopped falling and the headlines began to fade, life on the ground in the Middle East carried on, but changed. In cities that once pulsed with the noise of markets and the laughter of children, there was now a quiet edge, a subtle tension woven into daily life. Families spoke in hushed voices over dinner, uncertain about what the next day might bring. Soldiers in uniform became a more common sight, and the hum of drones overhead blended into the background of everyday existence. For ordinary people, the geopolitical chess matches of world powers translated into very real struggles. Higher prices at the market, fewer job opportunities, and the constant undercurrent of fear. Yet, amid the uncertainty, there was also resilience. Communities leaned on each other more than ever, sharing food, shelter, and hope in the face of an uncertain future. In refugee camps, stories of the night were told and retold, each one a reminder that history had touched them directly. For some, it was the loss of a home; for others, the beginning of a new life far from where they were born. The leaders who made the decisions would move on to their next negotiations, but for the people, This moment would become part of their identity, a scar, but also a lesson. And in quiet corners of the Middle East, parents whispered to their children the same truth repeated for generations, that no matter how much the powerful try to control the future, it is the people who bear the weight of the past. That night was not just about missiles, strategies, or even territorial disputes. It was about the rewriting of an unspoken rulebook that had governed the Middle East for decades. Until then, there had been an understanding, a pattern. Certain nations acted, and others responded cautiously, often restrained by fear of consequences. But when the clock struck midnight and the events unfolded, that rhythm was shattered. In the aftermath, military analysts spoke of a new era, diplomats whispered of lines that cannot be crossed again, and global powers quietly adjusted their strategies. The unthinkable had been done, and it had been done with precision and resolve. What once seemed like the natural order, where one side dictated and the other adapted, was suddenly questioned. This wasn't just a military action, it was a psychological shift. It sent a message not just to neighbors, but to capitals thousands of miles away, that the old balance of intimidation no longer held. In boardrooms, embassies, and intelligence offices, new calculations began. But perhaps the most telling sign of change came not from politicians or generals, but from ordinary people. In coffee shops and street corners, there was talk of pride, fear, and uncertainty, all woven together in a new reality. Whether celebrated or feared, the truth was undeniable: the balance of power had been altered, and nothing would return to the way it was before. History doesn't mark its turning points with fanfare. Sometimes, it's not the roar of crowds or the ink on treaties, but the quiet after a storm, when the dust hangs in the air and the world realizes it has shifted. That night, when the Middle East clock struck midnight, time itself seemed to hesitate, as if the region was holding its breath, knowing the next inhale would belong to a different future. It wasn't just borders, alliances, or weapons that changed. It was the psychology of power. A message had been carved into the collective memory, the rules had been rewritten, and they would not be erased. In years to come, people may forget the exact hour, the sequence of events, or the faces that stood in command. But they will remember the feeling, that sharp moment when the familiar world fractured, and a new one bled through the cracks. Midnight came and went. But for the Middle East, that midnight never truly ended. It lingers, an eternal reminder that sometimes a single night can tilt the axis of an entire region, and the echoes of that tilt can be felt for generations.